I'm not the house of cards that falls down easily. Oh, I'm strong enough to handle what you throw at me.
Welcome to Mental Health News Radio. I'm your host, Kristin Sunanta Walker. Just what are we going to discuss? The intimacy that is mental health. Let's continue to make it as comfortable as discussing brain health or heart health. This show has been on the air for several years, and we have amazing co-hosts. And then we created a network of podcasters on mentalhealthnewsradionetwork.com, a place where every possible facet of mental well-being can be talked about openly. My show, after several hundred interviews, the format is this: intimate, deep, funny, touching, sometimes uncomfortable, but always vulnerable conversations with interesting people. The goal is to have you, our listening family, many of you who have become my good friends, feel as though you are listening in on private conversations. Thank you for tuning in and becoming part of this amazing journey with me, and now with our network of podcasters. Just knowing this podcast might be helping any of you realize you are not alone on this journey called being a human being makes doing this podcast worth every second.
After all we promised, we'd be cordial.
Hey everyone, Kristin Sunanta Walker here. We are doing a Women Who Lead show with Catherine Greer Limpo. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, good morning, Kristin. How are you?
Good. Just so everyone knows, I am driving. I just spent, it's the weekend of after Thanksgiving in 2019, and I was just at Kim Saeed's house. We'll get into how that all turned about, but it was so lovely. It was such an act of self-care for me to just pack my stuff and go to her house. And so we'll talk about that, but we're going to focus for today's show on obviously women who lead, but also just the joy that's in self-care and really what self-care is. I read such a great, I don't know if it's a poem or it's an essay about what self-care really is. And I went, oh, okay. And we can get into that. But anyway, we've got a good show going for us today.
Yeah, I agree. And it's December 1st. So not only is it the weekend after Thanksgiving, but it's the beginning of a new month. It's the last month of 2019. So we're coming to the end of this decade. So I was just mentioning before we started recording that I'm becoming more aware of inserting joy into my life where I know I need it or where I know it will have some sort of an effect. And I think what we wanted to also talk about this morning was how that can carry over into, leadership, again, in every aspect of our life, and how important it is to be able to cultivate self-care regardless of what situation we find ourselves in. So I'm interested in the definition of self-care that you have, because I think people really misunderstand self-care when we say that. It's not, going and getting a manicure. It could be, right? But that's not what we're talking about when we say self-care.
Yeah, I read this post. It was so great. It was talking about self-care is a lot of those non-fun tasks like creating a spreadsheet so you make sure you keep track of your debt and keeping it updated. Self-care is making sure that you cook for yourself at least a couple times a week, if not more, at least one meal. Self-care is, doing those chores, like keeping your, some relatively clean space or organized space, if that's what you care about. The chores that we have to do in order to just feel less cluttered and less overwhelmed and, those kinds of things. And when I was reading it, I went, oh my gosh, that's right. And sometimes self-care is, you know what? My kitchen is a mess, but it's more important that I sleep right now. So it can be that too. But when I looked at it in terms of the get things taken care of, and it's also the don't use your hectic, busy life that you just don't have time to do anything as your excuse to procrastinate and drink too much wine. I mean, it can even be some things like that. So people do wrap it up in, oh, it's bubble baths and it's getting a massage and it's exercising every day and it's whatever that, those kinds of things. But it can also be just taking care of menial tasks related to the care and feeding of your life. That is also self-care.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And in a lot of ways, it's taking steps to find the space that you need to function effectively.
Yes, exactly.
And I'm actually going to dive right into the article that I was reading when I was a minute late calling into the conference line this morning, and that is and that is again Ford. Now, I'm a former employee of Ford, so I'm a big fan of Ford. I think that they do a lot of things right in the grand scheme of treating people like people. And there are a couple things that come to mind. So first, the article that I was reading this morning was from the Australian. It was the business section, and it was how job sharing, meaning, two people working a partial or percentage schedule are sharing a single position in Ford. And regardless of stigma or perception, which really doesn't exist in Ford any longer, it's just simply that there are job share folks in the organization, these people are getting promoted. And there are a number of folks already who have been promoted to executive level, director type positions while sharing a job with another person. Now, the way that the job share works in Ford is that you can have two people up to 90% full-time sharing a single position. So just imagine the bang for your buck Ford gets for, two, you can imagine, highly effective, organized type A folks,
Right,
women like us, working 90% of a schedule, sharing a job and kicking that job's ass,
Yeah.
And I'm sorry to use that word in the context of Ford because, sorry, that was my own language and not Ford's language. But the article itself was, just reinforcing to me that when you think about creating the space for people to show up as themselves, people come to the table with all of their potential.
Right.
The more that you can be authentic and the more that you can be free of distractions by way of self-care, by the way, the more effective you can be regardless of, what situation you're showing up in. And I just think that Ford does a great job of creating that clearance for people to do so. They really understand how to make people effective. And then the second thing that this kind of leads me to was another article that I saw on Terry Godboss. And there's another woman at Ford who I used to work with by the name of Julie Lodge Jarrett. And she, I believe now, is the Chief Learning Officer for Ford. And she made a point in that interview to say that there's nothing in her life that is not integrated. So she does not create compartmentalization between her work life and her not work life and her kids and, other pieces of her life that in some cases don't fit very well together. There's not a piece of her life that somehow, doesn't flow into one another because she's designed her life that way. So if there are people that somehow are not congruous with her values and the way that she wants to integrate work into her life and parenting and marriage and whatnot, she just simply doesn't have room for, either those people or those activities or what have you. And if you think about kind of the ultimate place of self-care, I would imagine that would be it. You've completely integrated to the point where everything that you're doing and every person you're interacting with has some sort of, deep purpose in your life. I just think that that's very interesting.
I love that. That is what I feel like I try to do anyway, because my work is just, it informs my personal life informs my work. In fact, I was asked earlier this year, and I keep being asked by different places, to start other networks, other podcast networks. And I've had to, just because I have this website that, some people think is horrible, or they don't think it's horrible. They love the engine that's in it, but maybe they don't like the aesthetic. Well, aesthetics can be changed, but we have 8 years of development into this website that's all set up for another podcast network. Literally, I called my web guy and said, can you cut an empty site with all and everything that are incorporated into it, and then we do new graphics and maybe the layout's a little more simple? And he said, yeah, absolutely. He gave me the price for it, and we can do that easily. Well, that is a mountain of work that you bring to the table for something. Mm-hmm. So I can see why people have come in and said, oh, could you set up a network? But the people that have come in are lovely people, but they've asked me to set up networks that I don't really care about the subject. Not that I don't think it's important, so don't get me wrong. Let's just use an example, since you're talking about Ford, and this isn't one of them, but we'll just use it as an example. Somebody said, I want you to set up a auto mechanic podcast network. Mm-hmm. I know for me that I will not do a good job at promoting it, at making it do everything it needs to do, because that isn't something that trips my trigger. Mm-hmm. And I mean that in a good way. I mean, I'm not talking about triggers and, mental health trigger, but I do care about spirituality. I'm moving more in that direction. It's always been there, but I'm really focused on it in consciousness and being awake in your life. And so finally something came up, and I get to work with someone really phenomenal who has talents that I do not possess yet, or maybe some I don't want to possess, but my gosh, I'm so glad this person does. And they really want to set up this other network. And the reason why I know it will be successful is because I'm completely invested in those topics. I will want to do those interviews. I will be excited about promoting other people who do these discussions and having them a part of this network, because that excites me. And it's very much like, what you're talking about with this woman, that informs my personal life. I want to know about more of these things because it feed me personally, and that has a wonderful impact on my business as well, because there is no separation between those two things.
Right, exactly. And I think it gets to addressing the whole person, as opposed to expecting a person to chop themselves into little pieces and have those pieces show up individually,
Yes.
So I like the fact not only that, Ford has kind of promoted this idea by way of their human resources actions, but also that the leadership really embodies the philosophy. So it's very much walking the walk and, practicing what you preach, and all the other good good anecdotes right. that you might want to wrap it in. I found that impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it makes me want to go get a part-time job at Ford and see what I can learn.
Yeah, really.
Like I have time to do that. But.
Yeah. Hey, and I wanted to, also talk about the certificate that Cornell University is offering.
Yeah, it makes me laugh because, listeners, you all know this, and I know, Catherine, you know this too, where it's December, and so I'm getting hit with all of these fitness things, get started on fitness, and also get started on your education, because those places know that the time that people spend a lot of money on these things is in the new year. Right. It doesn't surprise me that this ad from Cornell showed up, I think, in Facebook, or it was on Instagram, saying, oh, female leadership, and there's a certificate for this. And I filled it out. And one of the questions it asked me was, why do you want to do this? tell us, it was kind of like asking me to write an essay as to why it is I believe I should be allowed to be in this kind of a program. And I turned that into, well, look, I don't need this program. I am an executive already. So I didn't answer it like I was trying to get in. I answered it like, well, what do you have for me? Because this is all the stuff that I do. And so what can you teach me or bring to the table that I haven't already done? Is that the type of program that this is? And I haven't heard back yet, but that was my take on it. I don't need help with how to become a, female leader or female executive. Of course, everybody can use polishing. I want to see what you can take me beyond what I've already accomplished. So we'll see what they say.
Yeah, I'll be interested in the response. And I found the topics intriguing as well. So you and I have had a number of conversations just about the differences between men and women showing up as leaders. And we've even talked about some of the gender bias that we've either seen or experienced over the course of our careers. And looking through the topics here, I can't help but wonder what those new ways of looking at these might be, and ones that don't already, or not already, but those that don't continue to reinforce some sort of a gender bias. But in any case, I think the first topic in particular, I'm going to just read through the topics really quickly because I know nobody can see them. So the first is navigating the double bind. The second is negotiation skills. The third is using emotional intelligence to drive results. The fourth is giving and receiving feedback. And the fifth is outsmart the work-life balance. And I can see value into deep diving every single one of those, but to your point, I wonder, what new information might be shared about each one of those. And in particular, I'm most interested in any research that might back it up. So as an example, under negotiation skills, it says, learn why women are taught from an early age not to negotiate, and most importantly, how to overcome that training to become a skilled negotiator at ease with asking for what is needed to move your agenda forward. Well, how do we know that women are taught at an early age not to negotiate? And I really think that would be the value of the course, because it's less about the symptom for me and more about the cause and why they're teaching the topics that they are.
Get to the root. Exactly. And listeners, I want to say this. I've been doing more shows where I'm introducing new podcasts to the network, and those are necessary. I did have one comment from someone. I haven't had any negative comments, but I had one comment saying, well, all you care about is pushing new shows on your network. All you care about is the money about that or something. And I thought, okay, well, first of all, since we're talking about women in leadership and I am a female running this network, I do need to get new shows on the network all the time, because that is what helps me eat and what helps me keep promoting these shows. So should you decide to, and I hopefully, my plan is that 2020, I will start being able to pay myself back for my personal savings that went into creating this and still funds it. So just a reality check that's the reality of when you are an entrepreneur and you start a new venture. That's the reality of it. People have a lot of issues with money, and if they think someone only cares about money and blah, 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 then they put all this junk on top of that, and that just is so unfair. So there's that. And if you all decide, many of you listeners, to go to Cornell and look up this program and sign up for it, please tell them, guess where we heard about it? Mental Health News Radio Network. Because I don't have a sponsorship agreement with Cornell, but I'd love to have one to help support this network. So if they get enough of you garnering interest, they may just decide to let us run some advertising, which also helps fund this network. So that's my little commercial. Moving on to the next thing.
Actually, that's a really good point. There are a lot of things that we talk about on here, books and articles and other things. And, it would be nice to get some feedback as to, whether folks are going and reading these, or, if the sources are getting any feedback at all. I think that'd be very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to see a whole bunch of female listeners, which is, a big chunk of my audience, go and fill it out and say, oh, heard about you on Mental Health News Radio Network. That helps us a lot, because if I go to them and say, or if they come to me because of it and say, let's do some ads, yippee-ki-yay, that's fantastic. I won't, say the rest of that sentence, but anyway, so I think it would lend itself to there have been some instances for me at the end of this year where I've really experienced some of that old pat on the head, little lady type of stuff that I haven't experienced in quite some time. Mm-hmm. And it kind of is jarring, because I don't tend to experience that very often anymore. And it's been interesting. One of them was, and what does self-care look like for a female leader that still gets some of that stuff? Like, what does that look like? Does it look like anger? Does it look like lashing out? How do you take care of yourself when those kinds of things happen? So as an example, I was speaking to a male CEO, a white male CEO, just to give demographics here. And he was going on and on. And this is a nice person, okay? But I think that I'm asking you the question, Catherine, and the listeners. I'm asking you, listeners, this question. If I am seeing this properly, or in the way that I'm thinking, he was saying, I'm all for women in leadership. I'm all for, there's a female that I work with, and, she can do this and she can do that. And I say, you go ahead, honey, and I'm all for supporting that kind of thing. And when I'm hearing it, it sounds okay, but I also thought, well, thanks for the permission that we don't need, dude. That's how I took it. I was like, you're not really supporting female, and I know a little bit about this person, that they don't really do that, but boy, they think they do. And I think that that's still hanging around out there, that they really think that they are, but they still really aren't. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think actually that's the first topic in navigating the double bind.
Okay.
And the description says, learn about how the double bind facing women leaders, including how to recognize it when there's gender bias at play and how to address it. So imagine if you were able to have a constructive conversation, even just around the attitude, But again, and maybe this is part of the double bind as well. I don't know, feeling criticized for bringing those types of things up to begin with.
Anyway, absolutely.
I think that's more personal than. But maybe that's what this does. I have forwarded this already to a few of the women that I work with in my company, and have received feedback already from someone that was pretty enthusiastic, saying, hey, I think my boss would approve, me going through this. So I think it'd be interesting to follow this along and see what an outcome looks like. You get a certificate. It's a Women in Leadership certificate that you're granted at the end of this course. There is a fee for the course. It's $3,000.
Which is, but let me ask you this though, really quickly. Do you have to have a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, or is it not? I thought I had read that it doesn't matter. Anyone can take this regardless of your level of education.
That's what it looks like. We'd probably have to request more information. But it's ideal. It says for women who are mid to senior level managers and women with 3 to 10 years experience who are aspiring to move into leadership roles.
And there are many of those women that do not have any formal education, like me, who already are in those roles. So I would think that it does. And I think I had read in the ad, not the pamphlet that you're looking at, that it said no prerequisite of educational, formal
Mm-hmm.
education required. But we'll find out more, listeners, and report next time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of in the spirit of, the year and the decade drawing to a close, it's also just reflecting back on some of the conversations that we've had. And before we started recording this morning, I was talking about, finally taking the opportunity to paint a room in my house. So my son and I had painted a room in the basement for, computer and TV and stuff before we moved in, but the rest of the house was still kind of builder's beige, which is fine for some people, but I'm really someone who requires color somehow. And I painted my son's bedroom. So he picked out the color. It was kind of a race car red, a tomatoey red. And it's so interesting to me that even this morning, I can feel the energy that's being generated by that color in the house. And it makes me just want to paint the rest of the house. And we had talked about a TED Talk about joy and latent joy in environments, and how, that's important in every aspect of our lives. So how do we, and I'm going back to self-care here, how do we as an act of self-care look for these actions or elements that are important to us and make sure that they are present, because I think that in the busy rush of life, it's easy for us to get distracted around things that we really do value. And they kind of, sink into the background as we're busy sweeping the floor or going to work or, making dinner or what have you. So having a few days off and having the time to, kind of breathe and paint a room was really exciting to me.
Yeah. It just like it was really exciting for me and such an act of self-care to, Thanksgiving is a rough time of year for me. And it's also, when seasonal affective disorder tends to rear its head for a bit. And, for me to be okay with my friend saying, hey, come stay with me for a few days. And for me to say yes, that's an act of self-care, because typically I'm the one that says, come stay with me. I'll take care of you, even though I have I'm on empty already. And, and that's typically how it works with me. And then me saying, no, I don't need any help. Thank you. It's good. And, I'm all good. I'll be fine. So those can be acts of self-care too. Saying yes to someone who's holding their hand out. I mean, and having those friends, I'm stumbling here, but the fact that I could be on the phone with Kim Saeed, because that's how lovely she is as a human being. And I know a lot of you listen to her shows and follow her and do her courses, which I highly, highly recommend. She is just as wonderful as you may think she is when you're, watching and listening to her stuff. But being able to go, oh my gosh, and start crying, because I do not cry very often, and I certainly don't cry in front of other people, but I got it, that the reason why I've been having a hard time this year is because I'm out of a lot of the trauma of a couple years ago. So there's room for me to be sad. There's more room for me to be affected by things because I've done a lot of work. I've gone to therapy. I've done all this work to get to this place where I'm not just walking around reactive and active trauma. And so, but I literally had forgotten that Thanksgiving is probably going to be a rough time for me. And I had forgotten what my therapist had told me. Well, there is such a thing as situational trauma. And so I was like, what is wrong with me? I'm just going down. I upped my medication. I started taking my medication again to really, get SAD under control. I started feeling better, but I was still like, I don't want to be around anybody. I got invited to be different places and I just couldn't fathom going. And then something happened at one of those places that was unpleasant, that most, not at this time of year, I would have laughed off, but it really bothered me. And then I get on the phone with my girlfriend and I start crying and I'm like, oh my gosh, Kim, I completely forgot that it's Thanksgiving. Of course I'm going to be extra sensitive. I forgot. I'm sorry to me about this. And then I got my butt in the car and I drove to her house and we had a lovely couple of days together, and
good.
It's exactly what I needed. It's exactly what I needed. So those are acts of self-care too. I just, am pointing out that's what that is. And if you are someone who's in a leadership position, or you want to be, you have to remember that if you don't do those things to take care of yourself, that affects your ability to lead in a healthy way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, kind of coming full circle to the beginning of the conversation today, it's the making space to actually deal with some of the stuff that we really need to be effective, So I was actually talking to somebody about this yesterday where, when we're in the midst of battle, all we know is vigilance. All we know is to be on guard and to, practice being defensive because, we're the only ones who are going to do that for ourselves, or at least in our minds, we believe that, right? So by way of recovery, we get to the point where, we've not healed ourselves, but we've learned enough about that state of hypervigilance where we don't need to be there anymore. And maybe we're not in that situation, so we actually have the the peace available to us that we deserve as human beings. But it's when we finally have that space sometimes that the work really begins, because we're not in the heat of battle anymore. But the silence that's created by not being in that battle creates so much space for us to deal with so many other feelings that, potentially we didn't have time to before. And, kind of on a much lesser scale, when I was doing my graduate degree, oftentimes I could not sit down and write a paper or sit down and read a chapter and do my homework if my house wasn't clean. There was just too much distraction by, dirt in the corner or dog hair on this or that for me to be able to really sit and focus on what I needed to. So it was important for me to get my environment in order and create the space so that I could actually sit and concentrate. And I think it's no different with self-care. Yeah, but just on a different scale, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I've learned that about myself. And I live in a tiny house, so it doesn't take much for it to become a mess. And boy, it takes, 15 minutes for me to clean the whole thing. And yet I still can sit there and procrastinate. That's when I knew I was getting depressed, was, okay, now I can't get off the couch and the dishes have been sitting on the counter and I just don't have the energy to even put them in the dishwasher, and the laundry, that's, you have to watch for those signs of
right.
What you're not capable. And it doesn't mean you're lazy. It doesn't, that may be what you tell yourself. I have sat and told myself, I'm just rotting in my life. I mean, this is the kind of horrible thing that I say to myself. I would never, if I looked at me and somebody else during this little time period I've had, I would have been like, oh my gosh, how can I help? You'll get through this. But my God, would I say that to myself?
Right.
No. So some of that is, how kind are you to you when you're struggling?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm much kinder than I used to be, and I have much kinder friends. Boy, did I have some awful behaving, quote unquote, friends in the past. And they were a reflection of not what kind of a friend I was, but they were a reflection of what I thought I deserved. So that's certainly changed. But, those are self-care things too, noticing when you're struggling.
Mm-hmm.
And then doing little things even to make up for it. That's also leadership, because everybody struggles, including leaders.
Right.
Even really super successful ones struggle. So it isn't that the struggle goes away or that it doesn't exist or they've reached some mountaintop where they never struggle. Baloney. It's that they know how to care for themselves and they continue to improve that relationship with themselves when they do struggle.
Right. Right. And I think it's also, being able to really weigh that voice in your head, because we all have the hypocritical voice talks to us and says that we're not doing enough or that we're not strong enough or that we're not contributing enough or what have you. So I think, being able to temper that voice is also a huge act of self-care, because really all the stuff that we've been talking about, if we allow ourselves space and if we allow ourselves peace and, even partake in an activity that we really enjoy, unless we're able to create that balance with the words that we're saying to ourselves, all of it's sort of for naught. I can remember being, in the most relaxing situations in the past, say hanging out with my brother's family in California in Sonoma. It's just a beautiful place and a gorgeous environment. But I was going through a tough time at work, and I was, of course, my biggest critic in terms of the way that I was handling things or the way I was approaching things or treating people. And although the weekend had been set up to be, a really beautiful, relaxing, energizing getaway, I kind of spoiled it myself by not allowing myself the space in my own mind and being able to quiet and balance out my own voice. So it was interesting going back to work the following Monday, actually being more exhausted than I had been when I'd gone down to California for the weekend, simply because I hadn't been able to really take care of myself in the way that I knew I needed to.
Oh, that's a good, a very, very, very good point. And I think too that whatever it is that we do, it seems to be human nature. I still do it, not as much as I used to or at the level that I used to, but this thing that where we put people above us, and I'm not talking about just respecting people. I'm saying, and I got to do this in an example. Rarely do I make friends with someone who listens to the show just because I've had it not work out well in the past. So I'm very careful. I'm trying to be, I'm constantly ever better with boundaries. But the ones I have, like you, they're phenomenal. Oh my gosh, I'm so glad. So I'm never going to be somebody that says no to that. But sometimes I'll let someone do just a little bit more than I normally would, and then they'll hear that I'm struggling, and this is how I can tell if it's going to work out as something beyond just a listener of the show. When if they say, well, if it's like an affront that I actually struggle, but you sound so powerful in your shows, and you just said blah 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 blah, and that's in direct conflict with what you're saying you're struggling with now, and they're just like it's a personal affront that I don't have my shit together 24/7, and that's a thing that we do. I've done it with people too, so I am not calling anybody out. I'm just saying that's when I make a determination of, okay, this is not somebody that I need to put in the friend category.
No. You know what? This is so funny because I was talking to my my counselor about this yesterday, and that is, and here's another aspect of self-care. How do we not go around shaming ourselves constantly? Because that's what it is.
Totally. It totally is. Yes.
And every time you pose a question to yourself, right? Why would you do that? Why would you think that? Why did you say that?
Mm-hmm.
Anything posed in that way has no more intention other than to shame you.
Absolutely.
So so it's not only what we say; it's really how we say it, isn't it?
Yep, exactly. And Christina Hallett, Dr. Christina Hallett is one of the podcasters. She does the Be Awesome show. She's phenomenal. She just did a TEDx talk about how it is simply not true that you can't love another person if you don't love yourself. She calls BS on that concept. And I encourage anyone to go look up Dr. Christina Hallett, Hallett, and look up that TEDx, because it's so good. Because I'm not going to say I'm sorry. The reality for me is I can be wonderfully open and caring and loving and non-shame based with a friend while doing none of that for myself.
Yeah. Well, exercising self-flagellation in the background,
Right. Exactly. And so let's turn into what can we do that is self-care when we do have those things happen, those pats on the head, those moments where someone thinks that, well, not even someone else, where we are really not speaking nicely and kindly to ourselves, where I've had a couple of instances this year also with men, one very young and one just not much younger than I am, where they completely took my ideas and gave me no credit for them and threatened me in various different ways if I dare. I mean, this is how ridiculous some of the threats have been. Anything you do in mental health on film is my intellectual property. I mean, that's how insane this behavior is. And our editor, Joe, actually said to me, just, Kristin, you know what? You have such great ideas. Take it as a compliment.
Yeah.
So, because I'm perfectly willing to share this. Yeah. And I'm perfectly willing to share the credit. I'm not someone that needs to go, that's my idea. I'm like, I'll share it with you, but they still have to take it. And because in both instances, I said, your behavior is not appropriate. They went to their own toxic shame at the audacity of somebody saying, this isn't working for me, in a nice way, and turned that into discrediting me completely, because their ego is so fragile. And I'm like, oh my gosh, dude, seriously, do you know how many times men have taken credit? Some women, but mostly men have taken credit for my stuff over the history of time. Isn't that one of the things that we talk about in the Me Too movement that we are sick of putting up with? I've had that happen a couple times this year. And I wonder, you hate it each time. You blame yourself. How did I do this again? And the reality is, because it's still out there. I didn't invite this in. This stuff still happens. It still shocks me. Even with Me Too, I'm like, yeah, but it's happening. These people aren't informed and wanting to learn. They still are giving us permission to be leaders. Gives me a freaking break. So how do we take care of ourselves with that stuff still going on?
Yeah, well, I just, think about even this conversation and reflection, and three things pop out because that's how my brain works. So one is checking our words. So whether they're outside words or inside words, self-care, I think for ourselves starts a lot with what we tell ourselves. And of course, what we tell ourselves and the messages that we embody end up on the outside in the way that we treat other people. A lot of times we treat other people better than we do ourselves, but I think a lot of it just starts with that internal dialogue. So, and the second thing is intention. So what is the intention of the self-care? So is it to recharge our battery? Is it to make sure that our bodies are healthy for the next week? Is it, making sure that we're getting enough good sleep and, not allowing that internal voice to be a distraction and getting the rest that we need? And I think that even gets to the Cornell certificate. There's a lot of good stuff in there that I think ultimately, ideally results in being more effective, not just at work and being an advocate for yourself, but also it looks like, being an advocate in self-care and how to create that balance. And then finally, just sort of sneaking this into the side, thinking about my son's red bedroom. Seeking joy is self-care too, you know?
Right.
Finding even small ways to make sure that joy gets injected into everyday life, you know, whether it's through words or intention, or painting a bedroom red, you know?
Right. And they can be little things. It's even just remembering to ask for more joy in your life. So the other day, in the midst of some ridiculous thing that I could fight and throw a fit about, but I know that the person that's, you know, this male that's doing this is never going to go anywhere with it anyway. So what does it matter? And why even fight? Just look at all the connections I have and everything that I've got going for me that they do not that they don't deserve to have those things, but, you know, I've worked hard to have the kind of connections I do, and they blew it by being a jerk to many, many, many women. And I'm just I'm in good company. And so I'm just, the road of this one is just walking away, moving on, and not fighting. And, you know, and that isn't me not standing up for myself. It's actually me realizing who I am and that nothing can be taken away from me. Nothing. Mm-hmm. So realizing that, and in the midst of that, and, you know, you still go through the anger and resentment or whatever it is that you go through, but in the midst of that, forgetting that I'm such a good manifester that all I have to do, and it happens so rapidly, all I have to do is ask. I want more joy and laughter in my life. And within seconds, it comes rushing in. It's that I forget to ask. I forget to ask. That's all it is. I just forget to ask. So self-care is remembering in the midst of all the millions of thoughts that are going through your head, many of them negative, stopping and remembering to ask about the positive ones. Like, I want more joy and laughter in my life. And you know, what happened is I ended up finding out something pretty disturbing. And because I just asked for joy and laughter in my life, and I said, when these kind of situations come up where I really know who I am, I want to get to the place where I laugh them off because I know who I am. And you know what? This disturbing thing, because listen, the universe will manifest what you ask it, so be careful what you ask for. So sure enough, something came in the day before Thanksgiving that was pretty darn crappy. It's not going to affect me in a bad way other than just me being ticked. And I asked to laugh about these things. And so the next phase of yuck about it came up. And I literally, my first reaction to it immediately was laughter. Absolute hysterics. So imagine, I mean, I'm being vague, but I'll use someone else as an example. Let's say you write a proposal and it is beautiful and you're working on it as a collaborative effort with someone else, and their ego gets wounded along the way, and then they go and they put only their name on it and completely discredit you when you've done all the work. And you know that if you complain, you're going to be the one that looks like a complainer. They're going to fight you on it, and they're not worth fighting with. I'm talking about that kind of a situation. Mm-hmm. Yes, you should stand up for yourself. And sometimes, let's say this is done to you and you're a high-level executive, and this person is a junior executive, and they keep plundering one thing and plundering one thing after another. They can't touch what you've done with your career. So is it okay? Do you really need to fight that? Or can you literally just sit back and laugh? Because you know it's not going to work out for them in the long run. Sometimes you can, and that is not you giving in or, you know, not standing up for yourself or rolling over. Sometimes that's called age and wisdom, and how wonderful to be able to get to a point where you just go, whatever, okay.
No, that's not worth my energy.
Exactly. I make lemonade out of lemons all the time. I'm going to take the lemonade out of this because I'm still the one that does this, and this. Not that I'm better than anyone, but I see who I am and move forward. It's just not worth all that other, what is that? Rolling around in the mud with a pig, and you'll both get dirty, and the pig will like it. It's like, I'm just not even going to jump into the mud.
That's a good one.
Yeah. So thank you. And this happened to just so happen to be with a male who has who said in the situation, well, maybe I'm just the most sensitive person ever. And I'm thinking, pretty much. Over one tiny critique. This is why you get fired from every job. This is why your entire board of directors all recused themselves over a 2-week period, because no one wants to work with you. How sad for you. And go ahead and think you've won something. You'll do nothing with it. And I hope better for you down the road. And goodbye. And I'm going to laugh about this. Sometimes it's that. And that can also be an act of the most graceful self-care.
Yeah, I agree. I love the stories.
All right. Anything else you want to add to this one?
No, I don't. I will say that I'm looking forward to thinking about our conversation, reflecting on it over the next couple of weeks, and seeing how I can kind of balance out exercise, self-care, and manifest more joy.
Mm-hmm. And enjoy that red painted room.
Yeah, thank you. My boys' room.
Yeah, you're right. Because it's not just being in that room. It's also knowing that it's there and that you put in that effort to make it happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, we tend not to think about how much, this is why exercise of any kind, mental, physical, is good, because who you are on the other side of completing it or even trying it is a different person. So the act of trying and doing is the point. It's not that you crossed the finish line, it's that you tried to.
Yeah. Yes. And something I've said to myself over the years being a runner was, when you're finished with running, regardless of how long or how far you ran, you can't undo it. So that's the motivation to get out there and do it to begin with. After you're done, you can't undo it. It's great.
Oh, that's fantastic. Okay. On that note, anyway. Listeners, thank you for tuning in. And Catherine, as always, thank you for doing this series with me, Women Who Lead.
Thank you, Kristin. I hope you have a great day today.
Absolutely. And same to you, and same to you, listeners. We'll catch you next time on Mental Health News Radio.
Sometimes I'm passive aggressive, but never without good intentions. I heat up and act on my emotions.
Thanks so much for listening to Mental Health News Radio. Our podcast can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, and hundreds of other podcast apps. Or you can visit our website at mentalhealthnewsradio.com. If you have a question or would like to be a guest, become a podcaster on our network, or join the amazing organizations that help keep us on the air, please email us at info@MHNRnetwork.com. Get ready for that special goodbye from our resident therapy dog, Miles, and a special thanks to Emily Sohn for letting us use her incredible song, Cordial, for our podcast music. Listen to the full song on SoundCloud at emily.sonne.
Don't be surprised when I don't hate on you. After all, we promised we'd be cordial. Sometimes in you I can find it, but I oppose it.
Good boy.